Picture this, the world's right on the edge of a new century, and everyone's kind of buzzing about this idea of maybe talking to people who've, passed on seances or like the big thing.
Yeah.
And then from Rome, out of nowhere, pops up Linda Gazzera. She says she can't just talk to spirits. She can make them appear like in the flesh.
Oh, wow.
Quite an entrance, right?
Yeah, no, it really captures that feeling of the early 1900s.
Yeah.
Like peak spiritualism sweeping through Europe and America.
Right.
People were just like desperate for proof that there's something after death.
Yeah.
And people like Linda, they became like these focal points for all that longing.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today with excerpts from the Portal Luz Espírita, which is this online encyclopedia all about Spiritism.
Right.
Now, this is where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Spiritism, it kind of shares some roots with spiritualism, but it takes it like a step further. It's this whole philosophical and religious movement that uses talking to spirits, communicating with spirits as a way to understand like why we're here, even moral teachings.
Right.
It's pretty deep stuff.
Yeah. And in that context, Linda's story becomes even more significant.
Okay.
The Portal Luz Espírita gives us this unique perspective on her life, the intense scientific scrutiny she faced, and ultimately what her story says about our never-ending fascination with the unknown.
Okay, let's break this down a bit.
Sure.
So Linda's born in Rome, 1890, right in the middle of this whole spiritualism craze.
Right at the peak of it, yeah.
But what makes her different is her mediumistic abilities, these apparent connections to the spirit world.
Yeah.
They show up when she's just a kid.
And that's what grabbed the attention of all these researchers, even when she was still a teenager.
Really?
Yeah, we're not talking about, amateur ghost hunters here.
Right.
These were some of the top scientists of the day, totally captivated by her case.
Like, who are we talking about? Give us some names. Make this really sink in.
Well, there's Dr. Enrico Emoda, an Italian physician who spent years studying Linda.
Wow.
He documented everything meticulously, even published a book with photos, trying to capture these fleeting, ethereal phenomena.
Now, that's dedication, right? Trying to prove the unseen.
Right.
Did anybody else take her seriously? It must have been tough to be taken seriously back then.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And maybe even more compelling is Charles Richet, a French physiologist.
Okay.
This wasn't just any scientist. He was a Nobel Prize winner, known for being super rigorous. Not the kind of guy who'd easily buy into paranormal claims.
So if someone like Richet was interested in Linda, something really remarkable must have been happening.
Exactly.
To them.
Right. What they saw were, reportedly, materializations of spirit forms.
Whoa.
Picture a dark room, and suddenly, out of thin air, a glowing figure starts to form.
Wow.
One of the most frequent spirits was a cavalry officer who called himself Vincenzo, and another was a young girl, Carlotta.
Okay, now, this is where I get a little skeptical.
Sure.
How did they know it wasn't a trick? Especially back then. Like, they didn't have cameras everywhere.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Both the Emoda and Richet, they were very aware of the possibility of fraud.
Right.
They went to great lengths to control the environment during the seances, trying to rule out any chance of deception.
So they weren't just taking it all at face value.
Nope.
They were using scientific methods to try and understand what they were seeing.
Trying to figure it out, yeah.
That makes it a lot more intriguing, I gotta say.
Right. And what makes Emoda's research especially fascinating is that he noticed this strong connection between Linda's mood and how intense the phenomena were.
Oh, interesting.
In his words, he describes it like this. During the trance, Linda Gazzera presents, in her second physiological and psychic condition, a very different behavior. In her best condition, the trance is tranquil. The medium is content, cheerful without exaggeration, courteous, amiable. But if in the hour preceding the session she becomes annoyed, if she becomes angry or frightened, or if in the session a person appears who is antipathetic to her, or finally, if in her sleep the subconscious is taken by some passion, if her stomach is still in digestive activity, then the character of the medium and the physiognomy of the session change completely. In this case, the mediumistic force is even more physically energetic. Tremendous blows that shatter the furniture are given, resembling those of a mallet. The medium perspires, snorts, shakes, struggles, writhes. The mediumistic personality changes its character and assumes violent, brutal behavior.
Wow. It doesn't sound like your average ghost story, does it?
No, not at all.
Sounds like there was some real power there, though whether it was spiritual, psychological, or something else entirely, who knows?
That's the big question, and it's why Linda's story still fascinates us. Yeah, It pushes us to think about the limits of what we know about consciousness, the potential to tap into realms beyond our normal perception.
Right, right.
But there's another layer to this, one that takes us to Brazil,
Yeah.
the rise of Spiritism.
Okay, before we go globetrotting, let's make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
We've mentioned spiritualism and now Spiritism.
Yeah.
Could you unpack those a bit for us?
Sure. So Spiritualism, popular in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, was all about talking to spirits.
Okay.
Seances, like the ones Linda did, were central to it.
Right.
Spiritism, though, came from the writings of Allan Kardec, a French educator.
Mm-hmm.
He laid out a set of principles based on spirit communication, but with a strong focus on moral teachings and understanding, the purpose of life, our spiritual growth.
So they both involve spirits, but Spiritism adds this whole moral and philosophical exploration on top.
Exactly.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and for Spiritists, Linda's case wasn't just some oddity.
Right.
It was seen as proof of their core beliefs.
Oh.
The speed and intensity of the phenomena she supposedly produced, even when things weren't ideal, were seen as powerful evidence that the spirit world is real.
Okay, so Linda's story isn't just about one woman and her supposed abilities.
Right.
It's about how different cultures and belief systems looked at those events.
Exactly.
And in Brazil, it seems like her story really shaped how Spiritism developed.
Absolutely. It makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
How do our own beliefs and backgrounds influence what we see in these kinds of stories? What would we believe if we were sitting in that dark room with Linda Gazzera?
I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah,
Really makes you think.
it does.
Yeah, it really shows how one story can be seen in so many ways.
Okay.
We've got the science angle, the cultural angle, and of course Linda's own personal journey.
Right.
What happened to her after all that time in the spotlight?
Well, she didn't stay in the public eye forever.
Right.
After years of these investigations, Linda decided on a different path. She married Raymond Victor de Maison, one of the researchers who had been studying her.
So, did love bloom amongst the seances and spirit manifestations? That's quite a story.
Yeah, it is, and their lives took some interesting turns.
Mm.
They moved to Winnipeg, Canada,
Wow.
where Linda had her only son,
Okay.
and later they settled in Brazil, a place where Spiritism had really taken off.
From Rome to Canada to Brazil.
Yeah,
That's quite the journey, both geographically and personally.
it is.
Did she keep up with her mediumship in these new places?
It seems like her life as a public medium kind of faded as she focused on family. She died in São Paulo in 1942, leaving behind this legacy that's, well, it's complicated.
It makes you wonder about how those experiences affected her, the impact on her personal life.
Right.
Did she ever say she regretted it, like wished for a simpler life? Or did those extraordinary events always hold meaning for her?
Hard to say.
Yeah, I guess so.
And that's where the historical record, even with perspectives like the ones from the Portaluzzi Spirita, can only tell us so much.
Right.
But even with those gaps, her story still resonates.
Yeah.
Linda was part of this wave of mediums, a lot of them women, who challenged that dominant scientific materialism of their time.
It's almost like they were holding up a mirror to society, making people face the limits of what they knew, the possibility of something beyond just the material world.
Exactly. And Linda's case, with all these respected researchers like Amoda and Richer involved, it gave more weight to those challenges.
Yes.
It wasn't just stories or rumors anymore.
Right.
These were scientists, trained to observe and be skeptical, struggling with stuff they couldn't easily dismiss.
And that brings us back to what you asked earlier.
Yeah.
How do we as individuals look at these kinds of stories? Do we embrace the maybe unexplainable, or do we look for more rational, maybe even psychological explanations?
It's a question worth thinking about, especially with all the philosophical stuff tied up in Linda's case. Like, did her supposed abilities, if they were real, support the idea of dualism? That the mind and body are separate? Or were these things just the result of subconscious stuff, or even tricks, like some skeptics said?
There's also the cultural context.
Right.
We've seen how Linda's story resonated with the Spiritist movement in Brazil.
Yeah.
But how would it have been seen somewhere else? Like, in a society that's super skeptical or focused on scientific reason?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
How these events are interpreted, the meaning people give them, it changes so much depending on the culture.
It really does.
It highlights how belief is subjective, how our own views shape how we see and understand the extraordinary.
And maybe that's one of the biggest takeaways from Linda's story.
Yeah.
It makes us examine our own assumptions, consider how much we really know, and acknowledge that there might be more to reality than we can currently grasp or explain.
Exactly.
It encourages humility,
Right.
recognizing that the search for knowledge is a journey, not a finish line.
Yeah.
There will always be mysteries, different perspectives, and experiences that challenge what we think we know.
There will.
It's like Linda's story, with all its ambiguity and unanswered questions, is an invitation to keep exploring,
Right.
to stay curious,
Yeah.
and be open to the possibility of the unknown.
Absolutely. But I'm also wondering, and maybe this is going off on a tangent,
Go on.
what about the researchers themselves? What happened to them after their time with Linda? Did their views on science and the paranormal change?
That's a good question.
Yeah,
It's one that often gets overlooked.
that does.
We have what they wrote back then, but their later thoughts on those experiences would be so valuable.
Right.
Did Emoda, for instance, use what he saw in his medical practice?
Mm.
Did Richard ever talk about being involved with Linda publicly, especially given how respected he was in the scientific world?
It shows how these encounters have a ripple effect.
They do.
It's not just about Linda's story. It's about how everyone who met her was affected, how their own understanding of the world might have been changed.
Absolutely. And it speaks to why it's important to look at these stories from different angles.
It does.
We have Linda's perspective, the researchers' perspectives, and how different cultural and religious movements saw things.
Right.
Each layer adds something to our understanding of this whole complex tapestry. So, as we head towards the end of our deep dive,
Yeah.
what do you think is the most important part of Linda Gazzera's story?
Mm.
Is it the scientific investigations, the cultural impact, or her own personal life?
For me, it's how those three things come together.
Okay.
It's how Linda's story becomes a way to explore the connections between science, spirituality, and human experience.
Right.
It forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge, the power of belief, and the mystery is the core of existence.
Mm.
But it also brings up some ethical questions,
Right.
especially about how mediums were exploited, especially young women like Linda back then.
That's an important point.
Yeah.
We're looking at this with a modern lens,
Right.
but we can't ignore the power dynamics, the potential for manipulation and exploitation that was there in the spiritualist movement.
Exactly. And it reminds us to be critical when we look at these stories.
Right.
To think about the social and cultural stuff that shaped how things were told.
Yeah.
And to recognize the potential for harm that can happen when the search for knowledge meets vulnerability and the need for meaning.
So as we move towards the end of our deep dive, it's clear that Linda Gazzera's story isn't just some historical curiosity.
Right.
It's a way for us to examine our own beliefs, our assumptions about the world, and that constant human fascination with the unknown.
It is.
It's kind of wild how these old stories can, reflect our own time, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
We're still wrestling with the same questions about consciousness, what reality even is,
Right.
and if there's stuff beyond what we can see and touch.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's so important to really engage with these stories.
Mm.
Not just as historical tidbits, but as things that make us think deeper, examine our own beliefs.
Right, right.
Linda's story especially, it makes us think about how belief and skepticism work together.
It seems like that back and forth between believing and doubting, it's at the core of it all.
It is.
We've talked about the science, the cultural stuff, but in the end, it's up to each person to decide where they stand.
Right.
How much weight they give to the evidence, the experiences, the possibilities, you know?
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah.
Even among scientists, there were different levels of acceptance and skepticism about Linda's case.
Right.
Some, like Richer, seemed open to the idea of real paranormal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Others weren't convinced, saying it was psychological, tricks, or even just plain fraud.
So there's this whole spectrum of belief,
There is.
with total skeptics on one end, true believers on the other, and then everyone in between.
Yeah, it's a whole range.
Where would you say you fall on that spectrum?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think it's important to approach this stuff with curiosity,
Sure.
but also a critical mind. Weigh the evidence and admit that we don't understand everything.
Right.
But I also think there's room for wonder,
Yeah,
to accept that maybe there are parts of reality that science just hasn't figured out yet.
I like that.
Yeah.
Balancing critical thinking with open-mindedness.
Right.
Because just rejecting everything seems as limiting as believing everything without question.
It does.
Linda's story, with all its twists and turns, it kind of embodies that tension, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And it reminds us that The search for truth, especially with these slippery topics, it's rarely simple.
Right.
There are often way more questions than answers,
For sure.
more gray areas than black and white.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Linda Gazzera's extraordinary life, this one thought keeps coming back to me.
Mm,
We've talked about needing proof, wanting to make the invisible visible,
right.
but does that need for solid evidence kind of take away from the mystery?
Well-
The wonder, the very heart of the spiritual realm, you know?
That's a deep question.
Yeah,
And one that each listener has to answer for themselves, I think.
right.
Maybe the real magic isn't in the undeniable proof,
Mm,
but in the act of believing itself.
right.
That leap of faith that lets us embrace the possibility of something more,
Yeah.
something beyond what we currently understand.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
The beauty of the unknown, the power of belief, and accepting that some things might always remain a mystery,
Right.
and maybe that's okay.
Maybe it is.
Maybe that's where the real wonder is.
And for those who want to explore Linda's story further, I recommend checking out the portal Lusa Spirita.
Right.
It's got a ton of info, not just on Linda, but on Spiritism as a whole,
Yeah.
and all the historical and philosophical things that shaped her life.
It's a good reminder that this deep dive is just the beginning,
Yeah,
a jumping off point for more exploring and thinking.
it is.
There's a whole world of knowledge out there waiting to be discovered.
There's-
So thanks for joining us on this journey into the extraordinary life of Linda Gazzera.
Thanks for having me.
And may her story keep inspiring you to question, to wonder, and to embrace those endless mysteries at the heart of being human.